Hi, once again I'm Sydney and I am a servant of the Almighty God. Today, continuing this series of recognizing God's omnipotence, I want to introduce something I'm calling the ham dilemma. And this is because, again, I do a lot of research, and one of the things that I'm coming up against is, naturalists and scientists are basically saying that everything around us just, spontaneously appeared. And their favorite phrase is over time. Over time. So whenever we see something, and in this case, I'm focused now on the ESIS, what I call life's logic module, and the intelligence we see that directs the behavior of plants and animals, and even all the autonomic functioning within our bodies. Right? I'm saying that there's a life logic module that directs this. And the pushback that we all will get is that they're saying that, well, over time, these systems just build themselves, right? So, there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpackage there, right? And I'll go over time over time as well to try to unpackage some of this, because I even think about the pleasures that we have, right? Even like intimacy. And when you think about all the physiology involved, it would appear that different sexes, they've all engineered themselves, both physically as well as all the what we are hearing more now, the programming, right? So when you hear they talk about plants and animals, they've been programmed, but that program they're attributing to, just spontaneous development. So the program is developing itself. Today, let's say this is 2025, getting to the end of 25, getting into 2026, we are recognizing that to build AI systems, artificial intelligence systems, that without a lot of hallucinations and what we're discovering now, the madness that can come out of it, is that we have to invest a lot in training. So right now, you will also hear about the massive consumption of energy and the resources of intelligent people. There are huge numbers of people now involved in collecting and refining and distilling this knowledge to get rid of all the hallucinations and all the craziness that can come out of artificial intelligence systems. But if you talk to naturalists and scientists, they'll say, oh yeah, this all over time, without this kind of consumption that we are observing now, they just build themselves perfectly. We don't see any relics of madness out there where these systems are building and it just went crazy. Oh no, they all died out. Well, that should be an ongoing system, right? Where things should be, every so often you see something like, what was nature thinking? We don't see that. Well, to counter all of this, right, because that becomes a never-ending over time that happened. Well, there are 3 examples that we can use which does not lend itself to this concept of over time. And so I would love to hear how they address this. Now, this fits in perfectly with the concept of the creator, the ESIS, using DNA and the sensors, right? It fits in perfectly. But rather than, when we see lines and systems that says something intelligent build this, we go looking to see where is that intelligence. But I think, this is just my theory, if you look at history, we see that oftentimes, if you look at history, people go out and discover continents, massive lands, with people there, and then basically declare it as if there was nothing there, because whatever is there needs to be replaced with whatever they brought. And so you'll hear that, no, this is ours, because they'll even use God gave this to us, right? And so I think there's some of that that's going on here. when we discover DNA, when we discover stem cells, when we were granted the periodic table, all of these things, we just somehow seem to like, okay, just like maybe we did with those lands that we claimed, never mind what was there, we'll clear that if necessary and claim it. But all of these things, it suddenly becomes like the product of the discoverer. So just like, Columbus goes out and discovers this, it becomes Columbus's. Same thing we do seemingly are doing with knowledge. When we discover all the inner workings, the wonderful inner workings of cells and systems that support life, we are just claiming it. Because these things spontaneously just happen to be there, just like those lands, right? They just happen to be there for us to claim. We don't relate the intelligence that we see there to something, and look for that. No. If we went on to look for that intelligence, well, no, that we can't then claim it. So I think that's part of what's happening. But what I'm calling the Ham dilemma will basically short circuit a lot of that. So the first letter in Ham is the H, and that refers to hibernation. Now, let's think about the first animal. Let's use a bear as an example. The very first bear had to be pre-programmed to hibernate. There is no way that winter was one day, then a week, and then 3 weeks to give this bear, which also would have to live thousands of years, not just 20, 30 years or whatever. It would have to live thousands of years to adapt and change its DNA and change the functioning of its systems so that it can pass it on. So hibernation, when you think about not just the fact that this animal goes to sleep for up to 5 months with no food, it had to be programmed to prepare itself. This it doesn't have to be conscious programming. It's just like our immune system. Something tells us, hey, you better get out there and start feeding. That is programmed. In the very first bear, it had to be programmed, or it would not survive. You cannot take an animal that is not pre-programmed to hibernate and then just stick it in there for 5 months. Put a bunch of food in it and say, you're going to stay there for 5 months, I'm not going to feed you. So this behavior had to be, this intelligence that dictates this behavior had to be pre-programmed even while it was hibernating, in this state of somewhat suspended animation. Its internal systems had to be pre-programmed to support life in this new mode. Then when conditions became, good enough for it to get out again, these sensors had to be turned on. Something had to be monitoring to say yes, because it's not based on time, it's based on external things that the sensors are picking up. So you see with the ESIS, looking at the DNA says, you are a bear, I am looking at your configuration, you are gonna demonstrate these behaviors which support hibernation. This is not something that could ever be learned over time. So that's the H. The next one is estivation. This is where we see frogs and fish eggs and all these things. The river dries up or the condition becomes so bad, they would normally die. And let's take the example of a frog. It burrows into the mud and goes into this, again, the same thing, somewhat like the hibernation. It goes into the suspended animation and stays there. This is for an indefinite time. Now, normally with the cycles of the weather and such, which, it goes into even a bigger thing, because now it's like, well, the ability to sustain life is kind of tied to, but let's not go there. Let's just say this first frog had to dig into the mud and go into this suspended state. You take any other frog, right, and you bury him like that, you know what's going to happen. That's animal cruelty. You killing that frog. So these frogs, these animals that go through estivation, again, the very first one had to be pre-programmed. Had to be pre-programmed so that their systems, we cannot take something that does not naturally estivate, and toss it into that sort of thing and expect it to live. And this is something that absolutely the very first one, because this is not something that, well, we're gonna go into the mud for 2 days, then 2 weeks, and you live for maybe 500,000 years, and so you learn over time. No, the very first animal had to be pre-programmed, the internal system. The ESIS had to look at the DNA and says, you are granted this capability. The next one in Ham is metamorphosis. Think about this. The butterfly, the very first butterfly could not, because butterflies don't live that long. Because you hear, this is one of the fallacies of this over time. The presumption, I guess, that they expect us to accept is that these animals live for thousands of years. This one, and he starts changing. And somehow that will of that animal is passed down to the next one. So, or it started changing its DNA. And then the next one started changing. And over 1,000 people, they're all making little changes. But with metamorphosis, just like hibernation and estivation, the very first butterfly had to, first of all, know which tree or what environment to lay its eggs. So the very first butterfly wasn't like I was making butterflies and then I decided, but I'm going to change. I'm going to start making something else and then I'm going to... No, the very first butterfly had laid eggs which became caterpillars, which went through the chrysalis and pupate stage and became butterflies. The very first. And that programming, all of the physiological changes that occur during this process of metamorphosis had to be pre-programmed from the very first animal, the very first one. This is definitely another example of something that could not. There is no way. It totally defies any logic that this type of system, hibernation, estivation, and metamorphosis, could absolutely never be randomly developed over time, because the very first one would be a disaster. If the butterfly doesn't put the eggs on the right tree, the caterpillar, and we know this, right? If you plant tomatoes, for instance, there's a certain moth that's coming at night and he knows. That knowledge is there. This goes very well with the ESIS, right? That life's logic module. When in this moth, it says, no, I know which tree, right, where I'm going to lay my eggs. It knows. This is pre-programmed in the ESIS. This is part of the propagation of life and the reproductive systems. Just like I talked about, the pleasure that we get from things that we do. These things are programmed into the ESIS that works with our physical systems, just like one of the greatest things that we may find is that the intelligence that we build into our machines may almost outstrip the physical design of those machines. Because of course you need the machine, so one does not work without the other. But think about a car. It sits there. It's a car. It has tires. It has tires, it has steering. It has systems to drive and suspension and all of this stuff. But without this intangible intelligence, it just sits there. When we empower it by adding an intangible, and so in some senses, our greatest creations will be the intelligence that we can embed into our machines. Similarly, I see the Creator, one of the Creator's greatest accomplishments is embedding this very, very sophisticated intelligent system, this ESIS, and whatever else is embedded in there. And the sooner we start looking to find the centers, we know it has to be very much like DNA, because it has to, by the functioning, it must know the very makeup of the creature, because birds don't suddenly start trying to act like dogs. Snakes don't try to, to suddenly start acting like anything else. So we know the behavior that is programmed is embedded, and it recognizes the configuration that is that animal. And this may be the greatest, but like I said, all naturalists and scientists today, and this is what we are taught, and we just accept, right, that these things over time these systems develop. Well, I have been inspired to bring what I'm calling the ham dilemma, because these are three different types of implementations of this intelligence that could never be developed over time with some spontaneous, random stuff that just says, I'm going to suddenly have this butterfly decide to lay eggs on a plant, and then no, that does not happen overnight. And the very first butterfly had to have that embedded in them. Similarly with hibernation, the first bear had to have that intelligence built in, that ESIS that knows you need to feed because you will be in this suspended animation for this extended period, and to know when to wake up. You don't wake up in the middle of winter and just freeze. So this is the type of stuff that, as well as with estivation, with these frogs and animals that, fish eggs and all these things that go into this suspended animation for a certain period, that could not be learned over time, because the silly thing that goes along with that is that these animals would have to live for millions of, one animal would have to live for millions of years and be adapting every year, when in fact we know butterflies don't live like that. We're finding out that yes, they're going north, they have certain things, but that's pre-programmed, and that's the madness of this. It's just like in the past, when we discovered land, we just discounted whatever was there, whoever was there, and we said, well, I discovered this is now mine. And we may even say that God gave this to us. Now we don't, to discount the creator, we say, no, we discovered this because it was random, so now we own it. We never look to see, no, this is too intelligent to just suddenly appear. Well, let's deal with hibernation. Let's look at estivation. Let's look at metamorphosis, and we will see that there is a pre-programming that is so advanced, so sophisticated, and could never develop over time. It had to be placed there. It had to be embedded as it is today. Now, that does not take away from mutation and things actually evolving. That's a separate thing. That's where the ESIS looks at, looking at the senses, says that you have some external conditions that are a threat. And so how can I manage these genes? How can I make some changes to alleviate what could be an existential threat to the existence of this creature? That's a different thing. But the very first bear had to have everything, all the attributes and systems designed, and all these sophisticated interactions had to be already built for the very first bear to hibernate. I want to remind you that you encountering this is not just coincidence. It's a series of decisions you made, and so this is new knowledge that we need to make us a little better. What does this do? It starts bringing us to a creator that does not align very well with what we're being taught in religions, because religions seem to separate us. This is the sort of knowledge that tends towards science. Like I mentioned, Dmitri Mendeleev receiving the periodic table, which changed everything around us. This is the sort of knowledge where we don't need to go into a temple, a synagogue, a church, a mosque, any of this stuff to communicate with and build a personal relationship with our Creator. This is a Creator that shows that we are all connected. It's something that all the prophets talked about, that love, that's giving, that gift that we need to share. And this is universal. So once again, I want to thank you for taking the time for viewing this. And until next time, may God continue to bless us all. Thanks again.